Remember, you're muted.
There now. I think I'm unmuted.
You are.
And do I have the slide in front of you? Or it's the wrong slide. It should be a slide with this gentleman's.
Nothing is sharing, Paul.
Okay, let me go back and try again.
Okay, you've got it.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you again to the Monday Evening Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. And tonight it's my colleague and good friend, somebody else in the field of anthropology, and someone whose marriage is cross-cultural. And let me also highlight, and I hope things are still this way, that his wife and my wife were ill at the same time. And his wife had the advantage of her native people being able to come and sing to her. I think she was in a coma, but they were able to sing her out of the coma, and she, if I understand correctly, has recovered to a very large extent. My wife, on the other hand, didn't get to have her people come and pray and perform the magics for her, but she's moved on to the next dimension. That was 3 years ago on Saturday. And so we make these adjustments, but I want to encourage you to appreciate the cross-cultural dimensions that Thomas Murphy can offer us and appreciate particularly that he lives them. And that will show up, I think, in the introduction. He has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Washington, given in 2003. However, it was the previous year where he gained international notoriety with an essay, quote, Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics, unquote, in which he challenged the LDS claims the Book of Mormon people came from the Middle East around 600 BC. His DNA research accounted for Native American populations with no significant Middle Eastern component. His experience, then, of nearly being excommunicated illustrates the tension between the scientists and the dogmatic religionists. His advocacy for giving the microphone to Native peoples and for the rest of us to listen and learn from them opens the door for this evening's presentation and activity to an examination of the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. And so, Thomas Murphy, I welcome you back and anticipate all of the good questions and comments that we can get from this excellent forum that you've participated in numerous times previously. And thank you for that. But please join together in prayer. Prince of Peace, Son of God of creation, deity, beyond the mystery of history that put together the multiverse, our universe, our beautiful home we call the earth. We bow in respect, for we see in the daffodils the dawn of spring. We see hopeful geese flying north again, doing their thing, and we delight in the anticipation of a new season, the one of rebirth. And as we participate in the annual cycle, wherever we enjoy the varied seasons, we are caused to wonder, in our finite condition, why are we here? What are your infinite reasons? Oh, I'm stuck. And why do we do the counterproductive things we do, promoting the false and the partly true, and disregarding the love and direction that comes from you? This evening, we focus our attention upon the Iroquois, their constitution, their great law of peace, and we do so in a context of a world short on trust, compassion, long on war, deceit, mistrust, and we're seeing tribalism increase. And we would like for your gentle spirit to join with us, to bless Brother Murphy and all our participants of varying age, to apprehend and appreciate lessons from the Iroquois whose plan for peace included many useful elements produced by a people whose leaders were sage. That in this season in which in the thralls of winter we anticipate the blessings of spring, its new birth, and that we can learn to look through divine eyes, to see that all of creation, even those of us acting counterproductively to your will, embodies seeds of great worth. Thank you, Lord, for leading us to peace. Amen. And I will stop sharing. So, Thomas, you can. Oh, and should check if it's your preference to allow people to interrupt your presentation, or if you prefer to present and then take the questions at the end.
I think it'll work best if I present first and then whoops, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen here. Is that
Good thing we practiced.
yeah, right.
Uh,
That is not the one I wanted to share. Okay, so I'll try this again. Yeah, I think it'd work best if I do the presentation, and I'll try to save ample time for questions. I want to see. It seems like I lost the ability to share here. Okay, there we go. All right, now can you see Iroquois Great Law of Peace?
yes.
All right. So I want to offer condolences, Paul, again for the loss of your wife, and I do remember kind of sharing that time of suffering, and I'm very grateful that my wife Carrie is still with us, and that she can that I've been able to devote the time over the last now 8 years now that I've been her caregiver. It's been some of the most rewarding time that we've had together, and so I'm grateful for that. This evening, I am going to share a little bit about my upcoming book and an article related to that book. An article that kind of previews some of the material in the book. We're going to discuss the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. You can see pictured on the opening slide the Longhouse at Ganondagan. Ganondagan is a Seneca historical site, 17th century village, right near Palmyra and Manchester, New York. It's today run as the State Historical Site, and you can find the Seneca Arts and Culture Center there. And when you're visiting the restoration historical sites in the Palmyra area, please take the time to hear directly from our Seneca relatives, their story. And see, for example, that longhouse. That longhouse represents the name Haudenosaunee, which is the name that Iroquois used for themselves. The term Iroquois comes from the French, the term applied by the French. The term Five Nations and later Six Nations is the term that was applied by the English. And Haudenosaunee refers to the longhouse. And the longhouse consists of initially five nations, the Mohawks, who guard the eastern door, and then the Oneidas, the Onondagas, who are manage the central fire, and are the home place for a council of 50 chiefs who come together to govern the community under the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. And then you have the Cayugas and the Senecas. And in the 18th century, some close relatives, the Tuscaroras, came up from what is now North Carolina and joined the Confederation to make them six nations. A number of other Algonquian nations also came under the wings of the Haudenosaunee Longhouse and their protection, particularly centering themselves at Oneida, many of them. In fact, there were 7 communities, just like the 7 Lamanite communities in the Book of Mormon, that came together at Oneida under the shelter of the Longhouse. The founding story of the League is what is referred to as the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. That founding story, I'll give a very short version of it now, and we'll come back and look at it a little more in detail later on. But the narrative is of the peacemaker, and generally Haudenosaunee today refrain from using the name of the peacemaker, although you will see the peacemaker referred to in historical sources as Te Kanawita. And he was joined by Hiawatha or Ianwatha, who is another of the founders of the League, and a woman known as the Mother of Nations. And these three came together during a time of great conflict where the Haudenosaunee people were at odds with each other. The five nations were fighting each other and fighting amongst themselves within their nations. And the peacemaker brought a new message, an opportunity to unify, to care for each other, to take care of the sick, to take care of the needy, and to establish a system of ceremonies and clan structures that could bring peace. That system of ceremonies and clan structures provided the important ingredients for peace, among which was the leadership of women. Women are the landowners in Haudenosaunee community, and the clan mothers manage those land and resources. And they also serve as the electorate for selecting the Royaneros, or the chiefs of the 50 chiefs that govern the nation. And those 50 chiefs come from the different five nations. And so after a number of trials that the peacemaker and Hiawatha and the Mother of Nations went through, they eventually convinced Taradaho, or the leader of the Onondaga, to step forward to host the Central Council Fire, and together come together as five nations, and to adopt this ceremonial cycle and these matrilineal clans as a structuring organization of the society. And so the clan mothers would then elect those leaders that served in the council. Now, there's a lot more to this than I have time to summarize, but I wanted to give at least a quick overview at the beginning, so that what follows makes a lot more sense. What I have to share with you today is based upon an article that I recently published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. And I should note that I have put this slideshow, as well as that includes a link to this article, in the chat. So those of you watching tonight can follow that link in the chat. Those watching at a later date can go to my academia webpage, and there you will find the slideshow. The slideshow includes not only the images and text that you see, it also includes active links to the materials that we're discussing, including a free copy of the article, White as a Night, the Book of Mormon's Misappropriation of the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, and an audio version of me reading the article. That's also available on YouTube. That is available on my YouTube site, which is very small. Please subscribe if you visit. It's Dr. T.W. Murphy, and you'll find the article, White as a Night, read there by me. And you will also find a presentation of the same title from a few years ago for the Mormon Social Science Association. And you can also find me reading the article on Latter Daily Digest, and some discussions of this article on Dialogue podcast and on Mormonism Live. And there will be shortly podcasts on Mormonish and Mormon book reviews also discussing this article. And each presentation I try to make a little bit different so that you're not just hearing the same material over. This article is a synthesis of a couple of chapters of a book that I have written, and I've mentioned before here on this forum. I'm really excited to be so much further along in the process. I was going through the index today, trying to make sure you'll have a very useful index to find the materials you want. This is scheduled to be out from the University of Utah Press before the Mormon History Association meetings in June. The University of Utah Press is offering listeners here at Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum a 25% discount if you use the code Murphy25 and you order directly from the University of Utah Press, this website. I put a QR code on the screen that you can scan that QR code and go directly to the University of Utah Press's webpage. The book examines more than just the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. It's part family history. It's part an examination of the oral traditions within my own family of having an Iroquois princess in our family tree. I would learn those stories from my grandmother. I would learn later as a college student that those were problematic stories and that sometimes they did more harm than good. And kind of the impetus for this book is that I really wanted to know what were the actual stories coming from my ancestors, and questioning some of the biases that entered into the narrative as it got passed down from generation to generation. And so I wanted to peel back those layers and try to understand my ancestors who came from the Mohawk Valley. And I would learn some of them were taken captive by the Mohawks during the American Revolution and appear to have intermarried with the Mohawks. And that's where we get this story of an Iroquois ancestor in our family tree. Her life story is actually quite fascinating. And I was able to find some direct historical references to her. Her name was Susanna Ferguson, born in 1792 in the Mohawk Valley near what was called the Lower Mohawk Castle at the time. So the book is partly an exploration of that family history and kind of a deconstruction of it too, because the narratives as they got passed down to me became very strongly influenced by the prejudice of my white ancestors, and that prejudice distorted the stories from the way they appear when we go back in the historical record. So I try to get a better sense of what my ancestors actually, what their lives actually were like versus the way that we as descendants remembered them. And as I was exploring these stories and trying to get a better sense of the historical record of the community that my ancestors came from, I kept coming across stories that were similar to the Book of Mormon. As Paul mentioned, I'd already published by this time the articles on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And that had shown quite clearly that there's no Israelite ancestry of any of the American Indian communities, any of the indigenous communities of the Americas, including the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois. And so how can I make sense out of what we see from the DNA evidence and what I'm seeing from the historical record that suggests that there are actually some similarities between the Book of Mormon, or at least some stories in the Book of Mormon, and Haudenosaunee oral tradition. And so the book examines the two of them together and is really the first book to examine Haudenosaunee oral tradition alongside the Book of Mormon. It's also will be the second book to apply critical indigenous methodologies to the study of the Book of Mormon. The first of those is Elise Boxer's Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite, which just came out this past year, that I highly recommend to viewers here.
Cite that again, please, Thomas.
It's Elise Boxer's Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite, and I have an image of it coming up.
Okay.
This article begins with a quotation from Fourth Nephi, and I will acknowledge here that I'm using as my source Skousen's critical edition of the Book of Mormon, which uses the LDS scripture or book scripture and chapter and verse headings. So these references are to the LDS breakdown of the Book of Mormon. But in the LDS version, 4th Nephi 1:10 and 17, it reads, "And now behold, it came to pass that the people of Nephi became an exceeding fair and delightsome people. Neither were there Lamanites, nor any manner of ites, but they were one, the children of Christ." This is the way that the Book of Mormon presents the founding of a great peace that has many similarities with the Iroquois great law of peace. And it has this troubling reference that on one sense, there's no manner of ites, and everybody's one in Christ, but at the same time, it describes the people as white. And so we end up with this conundrum. How can there be no ites, yet they're still whites? And what is that privileged position that whites are occupying? Well, in fact, Max Mueller wrestled with this same, the historian Max Mueller wrestled with this same passage in his book, Race and the Making of the Mormon People. And he describes it as Lamanites and Nephites united to become one raceless, put in parentheses, white Christian people. So he describes this as a sense of a raceless whiteness. And more recently, Michael Austin, in his book, The Testimony of Two Nations, suggested the Book of Mormon injected something genuinely new in the divine curses racial etiology of genre of scripture, and celebrates the mutability of races in the scripture as something that we should be proud of, that it kind of separates the Book of Mormon from some of the stronger forms of biological determinism in racism that come later in the 19th century. I want to actually trouble this, because I think what we're seeing is a way in which whiteness is being rendered invisible by being conflated with Christianity. And that this conflation of Christianity with whiteness is something that we ought to be cautious about. Now, of course, it was commonplace in the 19th century, so it's not unique to the Book of Mormon, but it wasn't an idea held by everybody, and particularly, it's not an element of Haudenosaunee traditions, but we do see it in the Book of Mormon, and that leads me to see the Book of Mormon as what I call a settler colonial text, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. My argument is this: when viewed within the context of critical indigenous studies and the literary record of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Great Peace, the narrator Mormon's portrait of a seemingly raceless society looks a little too much like a settler colonial body politic that erases indigenous cultures and identities. So to understand the term settler colonialism, there's like a whole literature about this, so I have to kind of synthesize the key points. Most of us are familiar with the idea of colonialism, which is that you have a mother nation that goes outside of its territory into someone else's territory and creates a colony. And that colony serves the mother nation as a means of extracting resources and trade through primarily through trade to benefit that mother nation. It can be quite exploitative. It can often be violent, and we call that that governmental structure colonialism. Settler colonialism is a type of colonialism that takes it to another level. Not only do you have that outpost in somebody else's territory, but you have a genocidal component alongside it, in that the people coming from the mother nation, the settlers in that colony, don't only engage in trade as a way of profiting their mother nation, they also extract land from the indigenous people who they displace in the process. Now, that displacement can occur, well, almost always involves some sort of violence, right? And it can be, wiping the people out, but it also can be absorbing the people within the settler body as kind of second-class citizens. And that's what I think we're seeing in the Book of Mormon, is not an advocacy of killing all the indigenous people, but one of absorbing the indigenous people into that settler colonial body politic. So it is different from, for example, those that want to just wipe out all the native people or remove them, which was in the 1820s was a presidential campaign of Andrew Jackson of removing indigenous peoples from the East. That removal is another form of genocide, and one that sadly we will see Joseph Smith and some other early church leaders endorsing at a later date. But the Book of Mormon itself seems to, well, it does include some removals. So in that sense, it is a little bit similar to the removal policy. But the idea is that indigenous people should come together as one nation and then become absorbed into the settler nation, where they lose their identity as indigenous peoples and become, as the Book of Mormon puts it, one in Christ, that are also white or also Christian. So my argument also goes that the false narrative that one can be white, or as Joseph Smith edited the Book of Mormon in 1840, pure and raceless, has done considerable harm to indigenous communities, particularly when Latter-day Saint politicians in the mid-20th century drew from these same teachings in the Book of Mormon to construct a settler colonial state policy of termination at the federal level directed towards erasing indigenous sovereignty in the United States. And we'll discuss how the Book of Mormon gets implemented by politicians coming from Utah. Indigenous activists, when faced with the realization of that ideal of a settler colonial oneness of society that stripped their sovereignty, when they encountered that, they resisted termination in part by identifying the Book of Mormon as an overly Christianized variant of a larger body of Haudenosaunee oral tradition describing the peacemakers' unification of 5 nations: the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas. Now, for those who are not familiar with the Haudenosaunee people, I have a map here of the traditional territories from the 18th century, as well as their contemporary reservations and reserves. We can see again the Mohawks as the guardians of the east door of the longhouse, and you can think of this upstate New York as one long house, You got the Mohawks, then you got the Oneidas, you got the Onondagas at that central fire, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and then later the Tuscaroras would join. The Tuscaroras would first come into Oneida territory. Today, you can find the Tuscaroras over here at Lewiston in New York. And that's where we'll see a very important book published by a Tuscarora author that has a lot of similarities with the Book of Mormon. You can also see where Rochester and then Palmyra is and Manchester are down here where you can see my mouse circling around. This area near Rochester is Seneca territory. So the Senecas are the guardians of the western door of the Longhouse. We'll see my ancestors came from this area in between or along the Mohawk River, just to the northwest of Albany. And this general region shares a cultural tradition, similar languages. Each nation has their own language, so there are some linguistic differences, but they're very similar. This area before or during the Revolution, during the Revolution, most of this territory still was under Haudenosaunee control, with the exception of some significant settler movements into the Mohawk Valley and starting to encroach upon the Oneidas further up the Mohawk River. But the rest of this territory was under Haudenosaunee control for the most part. There were some outposts and forts along the Niagara, and there were some up here and on the St. Lawrence River. But during the Revolution, the Six Nations split their allegiances. So the Mohawks and the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas fought mostly on the side of the British. The Oneidas and some Tuscaroras and those Algonquian communities that had settled at places called Brothertown and Stockbridge in the Oneida territory, they supported the Patriots. And so you got this division between kingmen and freemen during the American Revolution that we also see replicated in the war narratives of the Book of Mormon. After the Revolutionary period, there's a process of removal that confines, limits the Haudenosaunee people to a number of reservations that you can see represented here. There were more of them in the past than we have today, in the 1820s, for example. But today, the major populations you'll see at Six Nations in Ontario. You'll see the communities of Akwesasne and Kanawake near Toronto and Montreal. And there are various smaller reservations scattered throughout the territory, both in the US and in Canada. But because many of the Haudenosaunee had fought on the Canadian side, that's why you see a lot of the movement back up into Ontario and even into Quebec. Now, we are at a very interesting time for the field of Book of Mormon studies. Here you can see a picture of Elise Boxer's Mormon settler colonialism, inventing the Lamanite. And what I want to emphasize is that something different is happening in Book of Mormon studies than has ever happened before. Okay. And that is, we are seeing publications in mainstream academic presses, university presses, mainstream journals by credentialed people coming from the restoration movements, publishing materials about the Book of Mormon in a way that wasn't done in the past. In the past, a lot of the publications about the Book of Mormon came from the church sources, whether it was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or now the Community of Christ, their own publishing presses, and sometimes those presses were associated with universities like Brigham Young University or the University in Lamoni, Graceland. Yeah, I was trying to remember. So we saw that in the past, most of that publication was coming from religious presses. And there's always been a robust literature around the Book of Mormon, especially in the 20th century. But what's different today is that we're having these conversations within the larger academic community. And the pieces that I'm highlighting here are not the only ones that we see in that dialogue. There are some significant works on literary approaches to the Book of Mormon that include writings by people like Liz Fenton, Jared Hickman, and Garrett Grant Hardy, for example, that are publishing kind of on literary perspectives on the Book of Mormon, that are also part of this new approach in terms of being able to publish about the Book of Mormon in mainstream academic presses. But the ones I want to highlight are the ones that are including indigenous voices. And many of these scholars hold important chairs and or important positions within major academic universities. And they are publishing excellent material on the Book of Mormon from an indigenous perspective. So I mentioned earlier, Elise Boxer's Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite, the most recent of these books, the first book to really apply an interpretive lens of settler colonial theory and critical indigenous studies to the Book of Mormon. But this was preceded by a number of other works that have helped build the ground for this. Hokalani Akau's A Chosen People, A Promised Land is a Kanaka or a Kanaka Oahe, or a Hawaiian native woman who is discussing the colonialism in Hawaii and the relationship between colonialism and the church. She argues in her book that a persistence of Mormon whiteness is a part and parcel of a settler colonial project intent on territorial expropriation of native land. And so she's saying that this narrative about whiteness is about taking land, a really important factor to consider. There are 2 volumes published by the University of Utah Press. The first was Decolonizing Mormonism, edited by Brendan Rensink and Joanna Brooks and Gina Colvin. Gina Colvin is a Maori scholar, and Joanna Brooks is the author of that book on Mormon white supremacy. And another volume edited by P. Jane Hafen, a Taos Pueblo scholar, and Brendan Rensink, who is at the Red Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. And this book would win the Best Anthology Award at the John Whitmer Historical Association. And it included some preliminary work of my own for what would lead to this book, Unsettling Scripture. But most importantly, what it's including is indigenous voices in the discussion of the Book of Mormon. Another key article published in Dialogue by the Diné or Navajo scholar Moroni Benali, Decolonizing the Blossoming Indigenous People's Faith in a Colonizing Church, he makes the argument that the Book of Mormon often functions as a tool of erasure for Indigenous people's rightful claim to land, politics, economies, and power. And so that sense of erasure we see when whiteness is rendered invisible. That is a way, and then indigenous people are absorbed into that settler colonial body politic their indigenous identities are supposed to be left behind as ites, yet somehow whites get to maintain their cultural identity, but the indigenous people have to lose theirs. He calls this a tool of erasure. And there is another Maori scholar. He's not from any of the Restoration traditions. He's not Latter-day Saint or Community of Christ. He's just a scholar who's taken an interest in Restoration studies. And his name is Hemoperiki Hauni Simon. And he has published a series of articles in mainstream academic journals challenging the ethnocentric biases in Restoration and Mormon studies. And he argues that the Book of Mormon exemplifies a religious environment that reproduces the hidden racial ontology that operates as a discourse of silencing. The Book of Mormon is silencing actual indigenous voices by presenting itself as if it were the one and only true history of ancient America. And when we as readers approach it that way, we are exacerbating that problem. If we are treating the Book of Mormon as the one and only history of ancient America, we are engaging in the silencing of indigenous peoples and the replacement of their narratives with settler colonial narratives. Now, I want to emphasize that that's not the only way to read the Book of Mormon, as plenty of presentations in this forum have shown. But that is sadly a common way of reading the Book of Mormon. So what I'm trying to do in the article is take very seriously these indigenous perspectives on the Book of Mormon and apply them in my own work, and to engage in dialogue with these scholars to see if we can't better understand our own traditions by listening to indigenous voices. And this is where an historical example, I shift the article from kind of the theoretical and the methodological framework to a concrete historical example of the harm that was done to indigenous peoples when the Book of Mormon's ideal of no manner of ites among us was put into practice at the federal level. This was an effort led by Utah Senator Arthur Watkins to create what he called an Indian Freedom Program, kind of a misnomer, and others called it the termination policy. The idea was to terminate the relationship between the federal government and indigenous nations, to dissolve indigenous nations as political entities, and absorb indigenous people into that settler colonial body politic, with no longer having their own representative governments, but being a part of cities, counties, and states instead. And Utah Senator Arthur Watkins wrote to the LDS church leadership in 1954, and I quote, "It seems to me that the time has come for us," he means the federal government, "to help American Indians stand on their own feet and become a white and delightsome people, as the Book of Mormon prophesied they would become." And a similar point of view we see from the LDS church president, or future church president, Spencer W. Kimball, who stated in 1962, "I firmly believe that tomorrow there will be no reservations. I look forward to the day." And what you saw in this political movement in the 1950s was an attempt to eradicate tribal sovereignty, and again, absorb indigenous peoples into the rest of the United States, and disband their tribal governments. In practice, that was extremely harmful to indigenous peoples. And what Arthur Watkins and people like the lawyer John Boyden, who would do a lot of the work, the legal work for this process, he and Ernest Wilkinson, who would become eventually the president of BYU, they through their legal forms, amassed millions and millions of dollars in profit from their legal work to dissolve these indigenous nations. And they gained access through subsidiary companies that they also had investments in, that began to exploit the mineral and other resources on these reservations that had been had their governments dissolved, and were rapidly impoverished. Some of the nations that got terminated included the Southern Paiute of Utah, the Catawba of South Carolina, who were predominantly LDS, and some mixed blood Utes were also terminated. Eventually, and there were nations all over the United States that were terminated, and so I'm just focusing on the ones that had a direct connection to the Restoration movement, and these would eventually be reversed once Congress realized how traumatic and how actually it ended up costing the federal and state and local governments more in terms of resources they had to put into these communities. After the dissolving of these nations, they restored the political sovereignty of most of these nations. That there are some mixed blood Utes that still do not have not had their sovereignty restored. But this was a very harmful model of implementing the Book of Mormon. Now, I will say that I think that their reading of the Book of Mormon overlooked some important things. The great piece as it's represented in the Book of Mormon involved the common ownership of property, not the dividing up of property in severalty, which is what Arthur Watkins was advocating. So I think it's partly based on a misreading of the Book of Mormon, but it's also based upon an implementation of this assumption that there would be no more ites among us, which meant no more indigenous governments. Now, the people who experienced this termination recognize the connection between the Latter-day Saint politicians and the Book of Mormon and the narratives that they were doing. And I want to provide a few examples of the activists working against termination and their tying of that specifically to the Book of Mormon narrative. One example is McKay Pickavett, a Southern Paiute who would be terminated. And speaking about termination, he said, quote, "We were supposed to be equal to our white neighbors. Well, that didn't work out. When Joseph Smith was back east, he met with an Indian guy back there, asked about Indian religion, and he wrote it down. And he says also, we ain't Lamanites." He is making a direct connection between the Book of Mormon narrative and its connection to Haudenosaunee traditions. The Oneidas, for example, he heard the story in Wisconsin where Oneidas and the Algonquians removed from Oneida territory now predominate. And another person who spread stories like this far and wide was Wallace Mad Bear Anderson, a Tuscarora activist who led a caravan of indigenous peoples who traveled the new freeways, the new interstate highway system, to carry a message against termination. And so Mad Bear was spreading these stories about Joseph Smith appropriating Haudenosaunee stories in the incorporation of the Book of Mormon. And there is a version that Nicholas Vorman shared with Laurie Taylor in 1994 that he said he had heard originally from Mad Bear Anderson. And in that, he noted that the Book of Mormon has, quote, too much emphasis on the Christian thing, more than there used to be, more than the way we pass it on, the Iroquois pass it on, the Seneca there to Joseph Smith. So again, we see these activists making a direct connection between the Book of Mormon narrative and the policies of termination being implemented by the United States government. And they're pointing the finger at Joseph Smith's misappropriation of the Iroquois Great Law of Peace at the basis of this. And so that's got my curiosity. All right, well, I want to look at if they're right, where did Joseph Smith get these stories? How did he get these stories? And so In my book, I go into a lot more detail, but in the article, I give one example. There are several other possible examples, particularly some interactions between Joseph Smith and indigenous people, Oneidas in particular, during his treasure hunting in the Susquehanna Valley. But what I focus on in the article is what I think is one of the most interesting leads that I found, and one that I feel like I've only scratched the surface on, but there's more here to it. There were ample opportunities for intercultural exchange between the Smith family and Haudenosaunee individuals at Moore's Indian Charity School on the campus of Dartmouth College from 1811 to 1816. Hiram Smith and his cousin Stephen Mack Jr., who would later marry a Ho-Chunk woman named Honanaga and have one of those interracial marriages, attended classes with Kanawake Mohawk Lewis Langford, Akwesasne Mohawk John Wheel, and three Senecas, Jacob Jameson, James Stevenson, and John Whalebone. Now, these Haudenosaunee stories about interactions between Joseph Smith and the Iroquois tend to emphasize the Seneca connections. That's what I see most often. It's not the only time. The earliest references are more general, just using the term Iroquois, and it was quite common earlier on, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, to use Iroquois as the most common term to describe. Even Mohawks would identify themselves to others as Iroquois, Senecas as well. So in more recent versions of the story, we tend to see Senecas being emphasized. So these Seneca individuals have captured my attention. One of them, Jacob Jameson, is particularly interesting because he goes from New Hampshire, where Dartmouth is located, in 1816, 1817, the same time the Smith family moves to Western New York. He goes to Buffalo, where he studies medicine, and he works as an interpreter for the United States government. And as an interpreter, he goes regularly to Canandaigua, where he's under the supervision of Jasper Parrish, who lives not very far down the road from the Smith family. And he's regularly interacting and even travels through the area as an interpreter, interpreting for the famous Seneca orator, Red Jacket, who spoke in Palmyra in 1820, 22, 23, not long before Joseph Smith started having his visions of a buried treasure that would become the Book of Mormon. Now, so that's a little bit on the oral traditions. There's also the possibility that these stories could have come through written sources. And so that's another aspect I've explored. Again, more detail in the book, but in the article, I emphasize a couple of key sources for those that are interested in this topic can dig a little bit deeper. The Book of Mormon's great piece resembles the version published by David Cusick, a Tuscarora scholar, in 1827 in Lewiston, New York, and again in 1828. Now, David and his brother were artist scholars who were selling their art and their pamphlets up and down the Erie Canal. And especially in the Niagara region, where Lewiston is just right near Niagara Falls. And so they're peddling their art and pamphlets in an area very likely to have crossed paths with Joseph Smith. In fact, the historian Dale Morgan suggested that a newspaper announcement of Cusick's book may have been what he called the catalytic agent inspiring the Book of Mormon. This argument that Dale Morgan made in the 1940s has been largely overlooked because it was never published at that time. He never published it. It was later published posthumously in an edited volume of his works by John Walker in 1986. But most scholars have not paid much attention to this at all. And so I'm hoping that my work is going to invite more careful study of David Cusick's book and its possible relationship with the Book of Mormon. Cusick's Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations is the first published account to attribute the Iroquois Great Law of Peace to a deity known as Teharon Hioakan, or the Holder of the Heavens. There are many other earlier recorded versions of the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, but they most all of them refer to the founders as ordinary people, not as deified, not as having the attributes of deity, but as just ordinary people. It's during the Second Great Awakening that these characters begin to take on deity-like characteristics. The earliest version of that I found is in 1860 in an unpublished version that would be recorded by John Norton, who was a Cherokee scholar who was adopted by Mohawks, and particularly Joseph Brant, who was a very famous Mohawk warrior. But that was unpublished and not available, certainly in written form. So Cusick's was the first that was available in written form. The Cusick's book also contains the first Haudenosaunee account of a Jesus-like old man who spoke of people across the water murdering their maker, a narrative that's echoed in the Book of Mormon 3 years later. And this character is in some ways similar to Abinadi. It's also, the message is also similar to that delivered by Jesus in 3rd Nephi. This source is a potential written source that Joseph Smith could have consulted in addition to or alongside or instead of the oral traditions as claimed by Seneca orders. There's also an interesting source that I wanted to highlight today and in that article. It's Henry Schoolcraft's notes on the Iroquois. And that's because the Book of Mormon's account also displays some similarities to the rapturous ecstasy of the peacemaker's appearance, reminiscent of an oral Onondaga version that was recorded in 1845. So this is after the production of the Book of Mormon, after the publication of the Book of Mormon. And it's recorded by the historian Joshua Clark and first published in 1847 by Henry Schoolcraft in Notes on the Iroquois. And in 1849, it was published by Clark on a history of Onondaga County that he published. Now, interestingly, Henry Schoolcraft called the peacemaker in the Onondaga version the Iroquois Quetzalcoatl, making connections to Mesoamerican traditions too. Now, the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, I want to come back to that and look at it in comparison and contrast to the Book of Mormon. We have the 5 nations, Mohawks, Oneidas, Cayugas, Senecas, who come together around a central fire at Onondaga. And when they do that, they do not forfeit their national identities. They do not stop being Mohawks, Oneidas, Cayugas, and Senecas. So this is an important difference with the Book of Mormon. So yes, the Book of Mormon shares some similarities with Haudenosaunee traditions, but here, as I'm trying to decolonize the narrative, I want to understand what are those differences. And the not losing their national sovereignty and their national and cultural identities is an important difference. In the Haudenosaunee versions, people retain their clans, their tribes, and their cultural associations. They also operate through a system of consensus that essentially grants the matrilineal clan mothers and their representatives veto power over Confederacy decisions. Not only do the women elect the male leaders, but they can recall them if they don't do what they tell them to do. So the women have a very powerful voice in this Great Law of Peace. The Haudenosaunee Great Peace maintains national sovereignty at the same time that there's confederated unity, and that makes it different than a society with no whites among us. The Book of Mormon's version erases national identities and mentions neither matrilineal kinship nor the sovereign political power maintained by the clan mothers. It claims there were no manner of whites except white Nephites who absorb and replace dark Lamanites. So in conclusion, a Christian utopia in which there are no ites except whites is a classic example of a settler colonial fantasy. The malleable racial body in the Book of Mormon is better described as a 19th century settler colonial construct than something akin to a novel postmodern perspective, a phrase used by Max Mueller. Presumption that whiteness is non-racial is a dangerous interpretation that has done, is doing, and will continue to do significant harm to indigenous communities in settler colonial societies. The scripture's white universalism is more accurately recognized as a settler colonial erasure of indigeneity. Now, before we go to questions, I want to remind people that you can read the article or listen to the article, me reading the article you can download it at dialoguejournal.com, and you can find a reading of it on YouTube at my channel at Dr. T.W. Murphy. If you would rather hear it orally, that option is available to you. If you want to study the sources and look into those, take a look at the published article. And I also want to remind you that the University of Utah Press is offering Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum listeners and participants a 25% discount on my book, which goes into a lot more detail than this article or today's presentation. If you pre-order directly from the University of Utah Press, you need to do that before April 30th. All right, I will take questions.
All right, I reserve that first question privilege for myself, and that I have to sort out a bunch here. But one of my first notes was the observation that I don't see any clear evidence of clans in the Book of Mormon, and yet clans, I think, are highly significant across all of the Aboriginal peoples, and it's rather unfortunate, I think, that the national government has determined that everybody would be identified by tribe, and the clans therefore have been bypassed, and yet in Native culture they're extremely significant. And so that absence in the Book of Mormon, then you just really highlight that to me this evening as being one of those clear distinctions. And I maybe I've missed something, but perhaps you'd like to emphasize that point.
Yeah, that is really critical because the clans have a reciprocal relationship with each other. So what the Great Law of Peace does, and you see this in other indigenous communities as well, is that the clans kind of have to take care of each other. To give you an example, if a member of a clan dies, it's kind of a parallel or sister clan that takes care of that clan. And so you have this reciprocity where, that thing that we often see in restoration communities is that we make meals for the families that are in bereavement, that have lost a member. That sort of social care is structured through the clans. And so that as a member of a particular clan, you will have a sister clan that you will take care of in those cases of a loss. And that's just one example of a reciprocal relationship that exists between the clans. So yeah, the clans are a form of identity that in some ways separate us from other people, but they are also in a functioning indigenous cultural system are providing responsibilities, duties to each other and an interdependent relationship. And so when you take away those, when you lose that reciprocity and that social structure that supports the reciprocity, then you lose some of the key ingredients to peace.
Let me illustrate that, if I may. My wife is of the Turtle Clan in Polynesia, but the Turtle Clan was widespread across North America and Mexico as well, and she encountered clan members in numerous tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And I was intrigued that the Ellis family were missionaries in Tahiti, and apparently they were adopted into the Turtle Clan. And so her family, the Faura family, every year goes to Sister Ellis's tomb and cleans it, paints it, prepares and takes care of it because they've been adopted into that clan and are deeply respected, even though she died, I think, about 1890.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's similar in Haudenosaunee tradition. So if you're traveling, what you would do is look for your clan members. And so the longhouses had the emblems representing the clans marked on the outside of the clan house. So if you're entering this community, there's actually a whole protocol before you even enter the community where you identify yourself and ask permission to come in. So you've already identified your clan, but then it's to your clan relatives that you're going to go. They're going to provide the housing, your lodging while you're in somebody else's community. And so if you've got this system where everybody is equal, while everything is owned in common, how do you travel, right? You can't go and rent a hotel, right? Because somebody's profiting from that rent of the hotel. What you have instead is a reciprocal relationship between the clans that provide an alternative to that exchange of money, a reciprocal system based upon taking care of each other.
Possible corollary there might be seen in the Mormon inclination to want to identify with the tribes of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that very curious because that inclination to want to claim being part of Israel is, I having married into the Polynesian clan, I think I prefer them. But the idea of people getting their patriarchal blessing and being identified with the tribe of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
about as close as we come, I think, to seeing clan identification in the book, and
Yeah.
that's really sort of a distant parallel.
Right. And an interesting one for sure.
Thank you very much. I'm just really pleased to have our group have a chance to grapple with what you're saying here. Let me back off and open up the floor for people to get their comments in.
Okay, thanks, Paul and Tom. James, Lucas, it's your turn.
There we go. Okay, so I acknowledge you've written a book, you've written articles, and you've referenced other sources, none of which I'm familiar with. So I'm kind of have to just go on the basis of your presentation. But I think I understand your larger sort of ideological perspective, where you're coming from with the trying to introduce indigenous perspective. So tell me if I'm summarizing your argument that you've at least made this evening correctly. You're saying that the parts of the Book of Mormon after the visit of Christ, where there's that 200-year period of unity and peace, is was inspired by Joseph's older brother's contact with some Indians at the more Native Americans or members of the Iroquois Nation at the more charity school in New Hampshire, which of course was a school originally founded for the purpose of educating Native Americans. And the Smiths were just kind of, intruders, if you will. Well, not intruders, but they kind of got in on the side of the opportunity to attend that school, and that therefore that aspect of the Book of Mormon was inspired by the Iroquois traditions of the Great Peace. Is that a crude but basically accurate summary of your argument you made this evening?
It's pretty great effort at capturing it. I would qualify it a little bit to say that my argument is a little more general, okay, in that there are similarities between the Book of Mormon and Haudenosaunee traditions, okay. And these include the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, which I am focusing on here. So I'm arguing that there are similarities. I'm also arguing that the indigenous explanations that are most common among Haudenosaunee people are that these stories were acquired through an oral tradition. They were shared orally with Joseph Smith. And that the evidence for that is passed down to the oral tradition. There are lots of variants of these stories, okay, but they all share really important things in common. That is, they attribute the similarities between the Book of Mormon and Haudenosaunee traditions to living indigenous people, and not to dead white angels appearing to Joseph Smith. And
So, oh, okay, I'm sorry.
yeah,
Go ahead.
so they see that the sources as living. The stories are not detailed enough to tell us exactly who those people were. I posit the examples at Moore's Indian Charity School as one of several alternatives, and the only one I focused on today, okay, of how that could have happened if it happened orally. I present a counter argument in the sense that I don't find the sources conclusive. Okay, I found another possible explanation in that Joseph Smith encountered written sources, such as David Cusick's Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations, where he would have been able to obtain most of the material that appears in the Book of Mormon related to the Great Law of Peace. There are some things that appear. It's a complicated argument because there are some similarities between the Book of Mormon accounts and later or accounts that are not written down until later. So that would provide evidence for the oral transmission of the ideas if they weren't available in public sources or published sources. So I can't rule out the oral passing on, and I can't rule out the written possibility. So I'm holding both of those options as possibilities rather than taking a side on one or the other. I'm just trying to follow the evidence without getting ahead of it.
Okay, so the the two Native Americans that you cited, Roman and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the other one, who got his information from Mr. Roman, if I can remember the name right.
Wallace Mad Bear Anderson, Nicholas Vorman, and McKay Pickett are the three examples that
so those are contemporary Native Americans.
These were events that occurred in the 1950s through the Mad Bear passed in 1985. The McKay Pickett was a recollection in the early 2000s of events happening 40 to 50 years earlier.
Right. Okay. So you have some, and I understand, especially when you're dealing with traditions which are oral,
right.
It's, we can't drill down and insist on absolutely perfect, contemporary, unassailable, historical record evidence and so forth. So I understand that, but I'd like to know, do you have any evidence of other than this possible association of Hiram Smith? Because I'm very dubious of the whole Dartmouth thing. I mean, I'm not saying that Hiram Smith didn't go to Moore's Indian School. That's fairly well established. But how long he went and how much it influenced Hiram and how much he passed it on to his younger brother who was 8 years younger than him. Mm-hmm. I think those are all very dubious connections. Do we have, but nonetheless, it's a possibility. Do we have any other evidence older than the recollections of a couple of people who may have inherited oral traditions, but who were, in the late 20th century. So this is like 150 years after Joseph Smith writes the Book of Mormon. Is there anything closer to the writing of the Book of Mormon that would indicate that Joseph had direct exposure to Native Americans who would have passed these oral traditions on, other than the happenstance that somebody published a book, that was around, but I assume we have no evidence that Joseph ever saw that book or had that book or knew anybody who had that book or so forth. I mean, is there anything else? And I'm not, I'm saying I understand that this is the historical record is a very difficult thing to work with, and I'm asking maybe for something that's just kind of unreasonably more precise. But I'm just curious as to know whether you have any other kind of historical reliable evidence that would link Joseph Smith at the time he was writing the Book of Mormon or before to exposure to the Iroquois traditions, government traditions.
Yeah, an excellent question. It's actually quite I mean, I write a whole book about this, right? So
Okay,
I can give you a couple of key pieces. Okay, so one, these oral traditions of the transmission of information from Haudenosaunee or Iroquois individuals to Joseph Smith. The first historical evidence or first historically recorded evidence of that comes from 1945. So it's quite a bit later. Okay. It refers to it's actually quite does not have the detail that I see in later recordings of these stories. It's pretty simple that Joseph Smith was influenced by Iroquois Indians in the writing of the Book of Mormon. Unfortunately, it lacks a lot of detail. And that was a publication about Mormons in Texas in 1985 by Stanley Banks. So that's the first or the oldest recording of these oral traditions I've been able to find. So, like you, I initially approached this very skeptically, okay, because it's much later, right? So now there are other ways to ask that question, and instead of saying what are the earliest versions of these stories, are there details in those stories or ideas in those stories that can be confirmed by contemporary evidence? Okay, and so in approaching that question, what I looked for is, are there in fact Iroquois individuals in the communities that the Smith and Mack families were participating in? Okay, and there's lots of that goes back to New Hampshire and Vermont. There was never a time where the Smith and Mack families did not have indigenous neighbors. And so these indigenous neighbors are potential sources of sharing this material, but they're kind of written out of Latter-day Saint history. But I've been able to show, going back to numerous early histories, that there were in fact indigenous people. And whenever I could find names, I identify those names in the book. Okay, so that my hope is that other people, myself included, can follow up on what I would consider preliminary research, right? And there are a lot of clues. The Jacob Jameson one is one of the more interesting ones because he's not only in Vermont and New Hampshire, he's also present in Western New York when the Smith family is there, and hunting and fishing in the same Mud Creek Valley or Ganargua Valley that Joseph Smith and his brothers are fishing and hunting in. And so I can put indigenous peoples into the communities with the Smith and Mack families for multiple generations. And most importantly, for a direct influence on Joseph Smith in the 1820s. And so in the 1820s, I identified many of those individuals that could have interacted with Joseph Smith and that were known carriers of these traditions that were coming through the Palmyra, Manchester area. I also look at the Susquehanna Valley. There we do have in some of the affidavits related to the treasure hunting trials. We do have direct references to Joseph Smith consulting a straggling Indian in one of his treasure pursuits. He then, in that same treasure pursuit, mimics an Oneida or a Iroquois, more generally, white dog sacrifice. And so there's pretty strong evidence there that there are some connections. I also find and this has been totally missed by all the biographers of Joseph Smith, connections to the Smith family in Ortega, New York, because Dan Vogel gets the locations of Joseph Smith's treasure digging with the Yeoman family. He puts it in the wrong location, according to some new sources that I've found, that place the Yeoman family in Ortega, New York. And in Ortega, you have I found this stuff because my ancestors were living in Ortega, and I was researching my ancestors, and then I came across these references to Joseph Smith that nobody in the restoration community had seen before, and so these, or at least that I was aware of, that were published, so these local histories claim that Joseph Smith was staying with the Yeoman family at a particular tavern. I was able to identify the location of that home, visit the home, go through the local histories of that specific location. There are pictures and stuff in my book. And interestingly, because the Book of Mormon, and this will connect to the next set of evidence, the Book of Mormon contains an Oneida oral history of the Revolutionary War that's not recorded for 100 years later. And that Oneida oral tradition, the people that were involved in this Oneida oral tradition of Oneidas helping to feed the troops at Valley Forge, there's an allegorical account of that in the battles between the Kingmen and the Freemen in the Book of Mormon. And that Oneida oral tradition, people that were participating in it are identified as staying in Yeoman's Tavern. And so I can put specific names on individuals that were also at least present. I can't say they were exactly there at the same time, although they were in the same year, 1825, in the same community, and could have been purveyors of that particular Oneida oral tradition. They could have been purveyors of the Great Law of Peace as well. And so that kind of quick answers here, but the other major source of evidence, and this is the one that in the end melted down a lot of my skepticism. Okay, because like you, I came into it very skeptically. In fact, the first draft of my book, I don't take a position on whether or not Joseph Smith actually had direct interaction. But what I did is a textual analysis of the Book of Mormon in relationship to the Haudenosaunee oral traditions, and there are just a number of Haudenosaunee oral traditions that make their first appearance in the Book of Mormon, their first appearance in the printed record in the Book of Mormon. And that's quite fascinating. And it's not just the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, but characters like Laman and Nephi resembling Sapling and Flint in the creation narrative of the Book of Mormon. Laman in the Book of Mormon is likened unto Flint. And the two of them are associated with light and dark, and you get all these really interesting echoes and allusions to Haudenosaunee oral traditions that are scattered throughout the Book of Mormon. And so, and I guess most importantly, because you could say, well, the Book of Mormon, it could be a preservation of these ancient traditions that the Book of Mormon is say the more accurate ancient account, and that these Haudenosaunee traditions are a distant memory from the Book of Mormon. But what I find are that the oral traditions that appear in the Book of Mormon are not just of the ancient past, but of the recent past, of the Revolutionary War in particular. And so these oral traditions of the Revolutionary War can't be explained by treating the Book of Mormon as a historical document, as an ancient source. And so that's a very quick summary of some of the pieces of evidence that address your concerns.
Okay, well, that'll be very interesting because I think I'm fairly well versed in the history of the Smith family and Joseph Smith, and I have to say that I don't, just off the top of my head, immediately recall anybody ever discussing the idea that there were still Native Americans in the vicinity. One would, reading all, including from secular and non-Mormon sources, one would get the impression that they'd been cleared out of the Palmyra vicinity. They'd been driven out and were no longer immediately present in that area by the time the Smiths showed up. I mean, that's just
but they are in the newspapers. They are in the early local histories. And
oh, okay. Well,
yeah,
that's interesting because, as I said, as you said, they know there's no indication that anybody's really picked up on the idea that there were actually Native Americans still in the Palmyra vicinity
yeah.
in parallel with the Smiths. Okay, so I see somebody else here. So let me ask you raise one other issue, which is a big issue, and you can pass on it if you'd like. I mean, there's a great temptation in any kind of scholarly study, especially when you're dealing with a historical record, which is by its very nature incomplete and vague and inconclusive. But parallelism is just a great, huge temptation. It's very easy. It's very
seductive. It's seductive.
it's very attractive when one knows a lot of stuff about one thing and another thing to see parallels when in fact it could be that there's just multitude other explanations, but when it looks, when you've got a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, sort of phenomena. So I just raised the question, which is probably beyond the scope of our discussion this evening. But one could look at that particular part of the Book of Mormon that you've raised in this discussion about the great peace following the coming of Christ, and see in that description of that episode of history, far closer parallels and echoes of Christian thinking. The stories of the early Christians in Acts who lived in common and had all things in common with them. If you were kind of, one could look at all that and say, oh, that's where Joseph Smith got that from. He was echoing the Bible. He was far more, I mean, I think he can state as a matter of fact that Joseph Smith was far more influenced by the Bible than he was by, any other kind of source. And so one could say, well, that whole episode in Third and Fourth Nephi is a reflection of Christian teachings and an expansion of things that are based on the Book of Acts and in the Bible and very strong Christian traditions surrounding that. I mean, there were many Christians who tried to implement, including contemporary to Joseph Smith, who were trying to implement that society that's described in the Book of Acts. So anyway, so I'm just saying there are the other kinds of parallels, which at least initially, and I again admit I have not read all of your research, but it just my immediate reaction is that I see far stronger. If you're going to do parallels, I see far stronger parallels between that part of the Book of Mormon and the Bible than I do Native American traditions that may or may not have been that close to that Joseph Smith may or may not have had that much personal contact with. But anyway, you may react to that. I'll not
agree
ask
with
any more
you.
questions. So
Yeah, I totally agree with you, James. I think that most of the similarities are probably biblical allusions that could have been adopted independently. And so that's a very fair critique, and one that I go into in some depth in the Book of Mormon, and in the book, Unsettling Scripture. And so I do think that the majority of them come from the Bible. And I do think I try to piecemeal out some of the different parallels that correspond with the Bible versus the ones that are corresponding only with the Haudenosaunee oral tradition. And one thing that's interesting is if you take the Haudenosaunee oral traditions, they're biblical allusions because they were reading the Bible too, right? And so when
they went to Moore's Indian School, right?
Right. Yeah.
That the point of Moore's Indian School was to teach them the Bible.
Right. So they're reading the Bible, and they're making these parallels as well with their tradition. Okay. And so what's interesting is that the Haudenosaunee allusions that I mentioned, the Book of Mormon has some of the first references to some aspects of the Haudenosaunee oral tradition. I'll give you one example here is the association of the Great Peace with an eclipse. Okay, is the first written version of a variant of the Great Law of Peace story that has a reference to the eclipse. An eclipse comes in Haudenosaunee tradition much later, but both of them could easily be biblical allusions. And what you see is that those kind of where the Book of Mormon gets ahead of Haudenosaunee tradition, and that's the first one, those tend to be biblical. They tend to be biblical allusions that were probably adopted later by Haudenosaunee, and I make a strong argument for that in an entire chapter of the book. So I'm in agreement with you on that point, but I will say that there are some elements like the three messengers or the three disciples. Well, there are some even there. There are some biblical allusions even there, but there are the three messengers that appear in Handsome Lake's visions and the three disciples in the Book of Mormon. It is not entirely clear of biblical allusions, but there are some interesting details in the Book of Mormon that again parallel strongly with Haudenosaunee traditions. And I better shut up so that I can let other people.
I pass the talking stick.
Yeah.
All right, Ron Smith and then Chris. Go ahead, please, Ron.
And Tom, if you would open or close the screen share so we can see each other, I think we're discussion time.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
So I just had two things. One of them is trivial, and the other one is a little more. Wasn't familiar with the Great Law of Peace, and am I? I don't think. How do I say this? Was it like a treaty that was made between the five nations, and is it written down? Was it written, or was it just an oral agreement, or how would you characterize the law of peace?
Excellent question. I think treaty would be. I mean, that's a later term, right? But it captures the sense of the nations coming together and making agreement, right? And in that agreement, the methodology for recording it was a system of a mnemonic system known as wampum. And if you look at the imagery on the cover of my book, is a replication of the wampum, which was based on these beads carved from quahog shells, and in purple and white. And these beads would be aligned in a mnemonic way to help to help speakers recall information. So the wampum served as like a signifier of sincerity. Okay, so that in diplomatic situations, if you're really serious, you would make an exchange of wampum. Okay, they also serve as a means of recording information, and so the wampum then records that treaty. And it just so happens that I'm wearing today a replication of the wampum recording of that Great Law of Peace. Here you see the five nations coming together at their central fire at Onondaga. This is the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. And that is the representation we see in the wampum belts recording these original acts. So we do have that Iroquois system of recording. Now, an interesting question and a much more difficult question is, when did this happen? And so the scholars and archaeologists tend to date the founding of the League of about 1450 to 1550 AD. Okay, there are some of the earliest sources referring to it say that it occurred a generation before the arrival of Europeans. And so you have kind of this early historical references to it, as well as there are a number of archaeological details, the use of wampum beads, for example. If these accounts are recorded on wampum, then there should be wampum beads in the archaeological record. Actually, that gets complicated because some of the earliest wampum was used in material besides beads that could have decomposed. So it gets complicated, right? But archaeologically, scholars tend to, and historically, scholars tend to prefer 1450 to 1550. There is a group of Haudenosaunee scholars who argue, and they use the eclipse story for a specific date in 1142, so about in about 1200. And so there's a camp of Haudenosaunee scholars and some outsiders, scholars that are arguing for that date of 1142 or about the 1200s. There are a few kind of outliers in Haudenosaunee oral tradition who argue on a really strong similarity with Jesus and the peacemaker, and they say that according to their oral tradition, that this happened, the founding of the League occurred before the peacemaker went across the salt water. So they would put it all the way back to Book of Mormon times. And that's a small segment of Haudenosaunee oral tradition.
Very interesting. Thank you. The trivial thing that I wanted to mention, back, back in the 1900s, when we used dictionaries as actual books that you would open, I looked up the word "ites" in I believe it was the Oxford English Dictionary, which had first use of, each word. It would tell when the first published use was, and "ites," the first use was, I believe it had like 1860 or something like that.
Oh, wow.
And which would put "ites" as the first use in the Book of Mormon. And I
Interesting.
just thought I'd throw that out for.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, Chris, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Great presentation as ever. I want to take the conversation another direction. Ever since we've crossed paths, and done some things together. One of the things you've taught me and opened up to me is the whole kind of indigenous readings of the Book of Mormon. And I've thought a lot about that. I think I confessed to you that that was one of the weaknesses I felt in my book. And you very graciously said it's a weakness in everybody's book. So that made me feel a little better. I've wondered methodologically where these voices best appear, say in something like my own work, if I did a second edition. Because sometimes it feels to me like what we're getting are contextual readings, right? Sometimes it seems to me that we're getting post-colonial readings. Sometimes it feels like we're getting reception history. And sometimes it feels like we're getting origins.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I mean, where that's been leading me in my own very very simple reflections has been that if I were writing the book now, or I were going to have another go at it, a second edition, that these voices would figure in a lot of different ways. Is that, I mean, when we first talked, I thought, well, indigenous assessments, that would be would merit a chapter or section. But it seems to me that what's developing is much more comprehensive. Not that it's all of the same piece of cloth, but methodologically, the questions that are getting asked and the issues that are getting researched, they seem to be reflecting different sorts of methodological approaches. Am I anywhere near accurate in my trying to size it up?
I think right on, spot on. Actually, that kind of overview you gave of the different methodological approaches was really good. And if I were in your position of, say, rewriting that book, I would try to, I wouldn't have just one chapter. I would have a chapter, but I wouldn't have just one chapter on indigenous perspectives, but try to thread it throughout. For example, I think I hope, this is my dream, right, is all future scholarship on the origins of the Book of Mormon would say that indigenous people have their own stories about how the Book of Mormon came to be, and provide an example. It could be the ones I provided, but there are others. And actually, this is where it gets really complicated, is that indigenous people all around the world have different stories. Okay. Yeah. And so every indigenous community, you have their own responses, right? I have tried to preference the responses from the communities out of which the Book of Mormon actually came, the land out of which it actually came. So I preference in this book the Seneca stories, and I think they should be given priority. I think that Senecas who were present in that area have their own version of how the Book of Mormon came to be, and they say that they shared. If I were saying it, they say that they shared some of their stories with Joseph Smith, and that's how they ended up in the Book of Mormon. And that's as plausible as the angel and the gold plate, for sure, if not more plausible. And if we're going to put the angel and the gold plate story there, we should also put the indigenous interpretations of that. And so that's one place that I would put it in. The other elements, I do think it's really important to see the Book of Mormon as one of many scriptures. And this is a theme I've presented on before here. And that is, indigenous people were producing alternatives to the Bible long before the Book of Mormon came along. And there are some, examples that come directly from Seneca territory, such as the Code of Handsome Lake, or even David Cusick's book has been likened unto a Bible. Okay. of the Iroquois. And so there are those, but there are also in indigenous communities around the world, like one I studied in more depth among Mayans, the Popol Vuh is an example of a tradition, an alternative to the Bible that developed out of that encounter with Christianity. And I think this is a theme that's quite fascinating, because in that missionary encounter, there are a couple of things happening. One is a recognition of similarities, saying that, oh yeah, we also believe that you should take care of the sick and the elderly, and we also believe that we ought to have equality in our communities. We also believe that we have a responsibility towards each other, that some of the basic Christian messages are recognizable to indigenous people. And so they're going to reflect back on, where did they hear these stories? And so those characters may or may not be deities, but over time, especially as people go through the missionization process, those stories tend to start to align more and more with the biblical traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a dialogue that's occurring between indigenous people and Christian missionaries that shapes not just indigenous traditions. What I argue in my book is it also shapes Christian traditions. And Mormonism is the best example of that. Okay. So that, well, take the kind of Enlightenment Christians were kind of hesitant about dreams and visions, but they're coming and converting Native people who their conversion experience is talking about dreams and visions. And they're having these dreams and visions that are like a greater manifestation than the Christian missionaries are having in their own communities. Their skepticism, especially that Enlightenment skepticism in the 18th and 19th century, is leading them to say, well, those things only happened in the ancient past. They don't happen today. Okay, with indigenous people, they're happening today. And so I see Joseph Smith seeing that as a greater witness, is the term he uses in the Book of Mormon to describe these visionary experience of indigenous peoples, as a greater witness than that coming from the settler society. And so you get a greater reception to the idea among missionaries as they're having these encounters. I said, well, maybe there is something to these visions. Maybe visions haven't gone away. Mm-hmm. And so then you get out of that, you get Mormonism and Pentecostalism, that I think both of which I think were influenced by charismatic experiences of indigenous peoples that settlers want for themselves and that they're trying to replicate. And so that's one area I would see threaded throughout your book, is that the charismatics that indigenous people presented to these missionaries, many of whom were educated at Oxford and Cambridge and then at Harvard and Yale and Dartmouth, and they were coming with a point of view that that is less like indigenous traditions than Mormonism or Pentecostalism would be, right? Yeah. And so I think there's a shift. I think one of the reasons that you see the success of Pentecostalism in indigenous communities is because of I think Pentecostalism was shaped by its experience, its encounters with indigenous communities, and learned to recognize that greater witness. I could go on, but those are just a couple of
thanks very much. I appreciate your work, Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Boyd, go ahead.
I just have a quick question. I was kind of in and out a couple of times, so I'm not too sure if you might have covered this or not, but it's my understanding that the Iroquois has had a sacred fire that they've been keeping for 1,000 years, been passed down, and it's always stayed lit. Is that, have you heard that before or know anything about it?
Well, that could the way you've heard it may be referring to a couple of different things. Okay, so there is the council fire. Okay, and the council fire was lit by Tadadaho, who is one of the founders of the Confederacy. So I mentioned the peacemaker, Hiawatha, the Mother of Nations, and Tadadaho. These are the key founders of the Great Law of Peace. And so the council fire was lit at Onondaga and was maintained as always lit, okay, to keep it burning. However, during the revolution, it was extinguished during the revolution. And that
You talk about the Revolutionary War?
Yes, during the
Okay.
Revolutionary War. And that allowed the nations to go their own way because they couldn't come to an agreement with who they would support, the freemen or the kingmen.
Mhm.
And so they extinguished the fire, and that allowed it didn't disband the Confederacy as some people assumed, but what it did is it allowed for a temporary state by which the nations could go their own way, and so some did ally with the British, some allied with the what they called the Bostons, the Patriots, and the so that and then the fire has been lit again, and now there are competing traditional governments, and then there are federally recognized governments in the United States and in Canada. So it's a very rather complicated procedure today. But the kind of the Canadian and U.S. sanctioned governments don't tend to maintain the council fire, but the traditional governments, and there's at least two of them, and one in Canada, one in the U.S., they continue to maintain a council fire today. Okay, so that may be what you have heard of, but there's also an older tradition that is part of the ceremonial cycle,
Yeah.
and that tradition has it is with the in around January, February area, kind of with the start of it, the Iroquois New Year. There is a fire, basically coals taken from a fire, that an everlasting fire, okay, that are used to relight the fires in homes of the community, and so that using of that fire and the lighting of the homes in the community is part of that ceremonial cycle. So that could also be what you're referring to. There's interesting parallels to that in Mesoamerica, where there are similar ceremonies of fire ceremonies, basically.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Doctor.
Rainbow Eagle, you're smiling, and I think we need to give you the chance to strike a fire here.
Well, I really would like to make a request of Mr. Thomas there. I would like to have a lot more time talking with you. It sounds like you have some resources that I would like to, give some consideration for. So I just make that comment. Christianization impacted the indigenous people of lots of places. North America, it was the Great Lakes, that was a pathway. And of course, the East Coast, and then the Mississippi River. So by the time that you're looking in the 1700s, there had already been quite a bit, especially in the areas of those three, of the indigenous people deciding if we're going to survive, then we're going to have to somehow become a part of, move, or embrace and adapt. So I think there's a possibility of that anywhere from 1600s right on up to 1800s and 1900s, that whatever could be called ancient, it was either went underground, as I've been told, or it just found its way no place. It just got pushed out. That's one thing that I don't want to, create an issue here, but I'm kind of curious, and here's my question. Are you saying that Jesus was a part of uh, the great law of peace in some way?
Excellent question, comment and question. First, let me respond to the comment, because I definitely agree with you. In fact, I argue in my book that Christianity was present in Haudenosaunee communities for at least 200 years before Joseph Smith arrived. And so that 200 years, that's most of the history of the United States. That's a long time, right? It's a lot of generations of knowledge and information that's being passed on. So, of necessity, there are going to be some similarities between Haudenosaunee and Christian traditions. And I see, or I read the Book of Mormon. Well, I read the Book of Mormon as one of many scriptures. Okay.
Well,
but
what
it's
about my
seldom-
question about Jesus? That's what I really wanted, because I thought you gave some inferences there. Go ahead.
So in the Haudenosaunee oral traditions, the peacemaker has Jesus-like qualities. Okay. And so many individuals equate him with Jesus, but it's controversial within the community.
Okay, brother, do you know that he was Huron and he had a name of Daganawida?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and there's a pretty good story that places him in his own journey,
Right.
besides being a Jesus-like person.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. So there are different variants within the tradition. Those that equate the peacemaker with Jesus tend to be most prominent in Cayuga communities today, although it spread from Cayuga communities more broadly across Haudenosaunee traditions. And there are strong advocates of that point of view. Okay. And part of the book, I trace that through the Cayuga Longhouse communities, and then its process of spreading across in the 20th century, this association with Jesus. It is not shared by all Haudenosaunee interpretations of the story. The peacemaker can have Jesus-like qualities without being Jesus, right? And so both of those interpretations coexist in the community and are often hotly debated, as you I'm sure you experience in your own community.
Well, to place any kind of indigenous people in a kind of a side-by-side reference to Jesus is a, a difficult thing to even consider. That's the reason why I was kind of curious about, because I feel like Jesus has his special mission,
Mm-hmm.
and there are things that can be considered about how that things are going to be changed so that you can survive and adapt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would welcome deeper conversations with you. And I should point out to the group as a whole, and is that I've agreed to do some of my next research projects in collaboration with the Community of Christ, and particularly looking at the work of Little Pigeon or Clara Nicholas, who identifies as Cree, and her husband, an Oneida, who used the pen name Gray Owl, and what was his first name? I'm blanking on his first name, but anyway, I am very interested in more dialogue with Community of Christ folks, so that I can place that work on the Nicholas family in more context with what's happening within the community of Christ more generally. And I just loved your presentations when I've been able to hear them. And so I would welcome the dialogue. So Paul, please share my contact information with Rainbow Eagle, and if he's willing to do the same.
Well, and Dwayne Nicholas, the son of Gray Owl and Little Pigeon, lives in Lamoni. He is in a wheelchair and not particularly mobile, but I do hope and anticipate you'll have a chance to come and interview him because, well, he's one of your closer sources to the family.
Yeah.
And yeah, he would be delighted to be contacted, I'm sure.
Thomas, my name is Rainbow Eagle, and the number 72@gmail.com, brother. Happy to have some time with you and see if we could Zoom together.
Okay. And my email is thomaswmurphy90@gmail.com.
Oh, 90. Okay. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is past 10 o'clock, and I try to get things closed by 10 because we have had occasions that have gone to 12. That really puts me in a bind for getting to Lamoni for my 10 o'clock meeting in the morning. And so I would much prefer that we close it. And so if you will allow me, let me just sing us off with, "We limit not the truth of God to our poor reach of mind, by notions of our day and sect, crude, partial, and confined. Now let a new and better hope within our hearts be stirred. The Lord hath yet more light and truth to spread forth from his word." I anticipate that we can all accept that and agree with it. Let us continue his pursuit. And may the good Lord bless you, give you good rest, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Oh, I did have one more little comment. Thomas, I've been working on the golden rule, and I've got over 150 expressions of the golden rule reaching across the world's cultures, and that strikes me as being perhaps one of because you mentioned it effectively as being the kind of thing that we want to treat the old and we want to treat people respectfully. That's such a fundamental, basic scripture around the world. I'm intrigued by its commonality with all the great religions and cross-culturally to an extraordinarily large extent.
And we would all do well to live by that.
Yeah, let us learn to be more compassionate. Oh yes, thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and thank